They expected a harvest of humanity. Instead, they lost everything. Junior Logistics Officer Ven Kestar had reviewed 4,012 harvest dossiers in his career, and none of them had ever been stamped in red before he opened the file marked UL3, the third rock from an unremarkable yellow star. He almost didn't notice the stamp at first. It sat in the corner of the cover sheet, small and administrative, the kind of mark that meant nothing until it meant everything. Do not engage. Unquantifiable. He stared at it for a long moment before he understood that he was looking at his own future. But that came later. To understand how a species with no functioning starships, no unified government, and a habit of filming its own catastrophes for entertainment brought an interstellar harvesting fleet to its knees, you have to go back to the beginning, when the file was still green, and the numbers still made sense. The Cultivate Directorate had been harvesting sapient worlds for 11,000 cycles. It was not conquest, not in the way the old stories told it. There was no need to conquer a species you intended to process gently. The Directorate's method was elegant. Identify a world with a large, biologically diverse, cognitively active population. Deploy a stasis field that suspended every mind within its radius in a dreamless, painless hold. Extract the population in bulk. Convert their neural architecture into the raw processing substrate that powered every cultivator ship, city, and mind in the galaxy. It was, by any measure the Directorate used, a mercy. Harvested species did not suffer. They simply stopped mid-thought and were gone. Grief was not a variable in the model because grief required someone left behind to feel it, and the Directorate's operations were fast enough that entire cities went still within the same hour. Earth had been under observation for 140 cycles before the harvest order was approved. The observation reports, compiled by a rotating cast of junior analysts long since promoted or retired, painted a species that fit the profile almost too well. Short lifespans, fractured governance, constant low-grade conflict that kept the population from ever fully cooperating against an external threat. High birth rate, which meant the harvest yield would replenish on a workable cycle if a second pass was ever needed. Emotional volatility that the analysts filed under behavioral noise, rather than anything worth a second look. The final approval memo, which Ven had read as part of his onboarding packet, contained a single line that he would later think about more than any other sentence in his career. Species presents no coordinated defense capability and is expected to offer negligible resistance. Ven did not write that line. He had only been assigned to the Sol 3 harvest 6 days before the fleet's arrival window, as a junior logistics officer whose job was to monitor extraction quotas against projected models and flag deviations before they became expensive. It was not a glamorous posting. It was, in fact, considered slightly beneath his qualifications, the kind of assignment given to an officer whose superiors weren't sure yet whether he had the right instincts. Ven suspected this was correct. He was thorough, not brilliant. He liked spreadsheets because they didn't lie to him. He had never once, in 4,011 prior dossiers, encountered a harvest that didn't resolve within the projected variance band. Sol 3 would be the 4,012th. He had come up through the Directorate the ordinary way, cycles of aptitude testing sorting him early into the logistics track rather than the strategy track, a distinction that in cultivator society was less about intelligence and more about temperament. Strategists were trained to imagine what a species might do. Logistics officers were trained to measure what a species actually did, against a plan, and correct for the gap. It was quieter work, less prestigious, but Ven had always privately believed it was more honest. Strategy dealt in expectations. Logistics dealt in what was real, whether or not anyone liked the shape of it. He kept a small, private ritual before opening any new harvest dossier, a habit none of his supervisors knew about because it would have looked, to them, like sentiment, and sentiment was not a trait the logistics track rewarded. He would read the species name, not the Directorate's internal designation but whatever the species called itself, if the intelligence division had bothered to record it, before he looked at a single number. It was a small thing, cost him nothing. It made the dossiers feel, for a moment, like more than inventory. The Sol 3 file called them humans. The observation record, when Ven eventually went back and read it in full rather than trusting the summary he'd been given at onboarding, told a stranger story than the approval memo let on. 140 cycles of watching, and the Directorate satellites had, almost by chance, spent most of that time trained on the quiet parts of the planet. Agricultural belts, suburban grids, livestock migrations that moved with a predictability the analysts found soothing after decades of studying more volatile worlds. The observation program had never been designed to lie. It had simply been designed efficiently, sampling the calmest, most statistically representative regions of the planet's surface, on the reasonable assumption that a representative sample would tell the truth about the whole. It hadn't accounted for the fact that humans, unlike every other species in the Directorate's 11,000 cycle record, behaved almost identically whether they were calm or in crisis, and that the difference only showed up in the parts of their lives the satellites had been calibrated to skip. Wars, when they happened, were mostly fought in places the observation program's sampling grid had deprioritized as statistically insignificant outliers. Disasters were logged as isolated data points, not patterns. The analysts who compiled the final approval memo had, in effect, spent a century and a half watching a species be ordinary, and concluded from that ordinariness that there was nothing else to find. No one had thought to ask what the same species looked like on its worst day, because the worst days had, through nothing but bad statistical luck, never once landed inside the sampling window. Venn found this, of all the discoveries in his side file, the hardest to sit with. It wasn't that the Directorate had been outmatched. It was that they had simply never looked in the right direction, and 140 cycles of careful, well-funded, procedurally sound observation had produced a portrait of humanity that was accurate in every particular and true almost nowhere that mattered. The fleet arrived on what the humans, in their fractured and overlapping calendars, called a Tuesday in early autumn. The timing had been chosen for efficiency, not cruelty, a lull in the seasonal migration patterns the Directorate had observed, when population density in the Northern Hemisphere cities was at its highest and outdoor activity, which complicated stasis field calibration, was at its lowest. The first stasis pulse went out over a coastal city of 9 million people at 11:04 a.m. local time. Venn watched the extraction dashboard from the logistics deck of the flagship Meridian Accord, a wall of soft blue light showing projected yield curves overlaid against live telemetry. The projection was a smooth arc. The telemetry for the first 4 minutes tracked it almost perfectly. Then it didn't. The first deviation was small enough that Venn almost filed it as sensor noise. A cluster of individuals near the harbor, 612 people, the dashboard specified, with the Directorate's characteristic precision, failed to enter stasis on schedule. Not resisted. Failed to enter. The field had reached them, the biological interface had engaged, and then something in the extraction curve simply refused to close. He flagged it. Protocol. He expected a technician to reply within the hour with an equipment calibration note, the kind of routine correction that happened on nearly every harvest. Something about humidity, salt content in the air, an atmospheric variable nobody had bothered modeling because it had never mattered before. The reply, when it came 2 hours later, was not routine. Asterisk field engaged correctly. Subjects did not achieve stasis threshold. Preliminary analysis. Subjects exhibited acute stress response neurochemistry exceeding calibration ceiling. Investigating. Asterisk. Then read it 3 times. The Directorate stasis field worked by matching a target consciousness's baseline neural rhythm and gently, painlessly, guiding it down into stillness. It required the subject's mind to be, on some level, reachable, coherent enough for the field to find a rhythm to entrain. It had worked on 41 prior harvested species, including 2 with documented emotional lives more complex than the Directorate's own analysts. It should have worked on 600 humans standing near a harbor. Instead, 612 people whose brains were, by every prior model, supposed to be the easiest part of the operation, had simply refused to go quiet. By the end of the first day, the pattern had a name in the internal logs. Flare events. Not resistance, not sabotage. The humans in question weren't fighting the field, weren't even aware, in most cases, that anything was happening to them at all. They were simply generating neurochemical spikes so severe, so suddenly, that the stasis field's entrainment algorithm lost its lock and had to restart. The harvest yield for the coastal city came in at 61% of projection. Not catastrophic. Frustrating, but within the range the Directorate's risk models allowed for a single anomalous region. Venn's supervisor, a broad, weary cultivator named Director Asavrai, told the logistics team not to overreact. Every world has outlier clusters, she said, in the flat tone of someone who had said the same thing on 40 prior harvests and expected to say it on 40 more. Adjust the calibration ceiling and move to the next region. They adjusted the calibration ceiling. They moved to the next region. It happened again. Not in the same numbers, this time it was a rural agricultural belt, sparse and quiet, exactly the kind of low-density population that should have entrained without incident. But scattered through the fields and small towns, in numbers too irregular to be an equipment fault, pockets of humans kept blowing past the recalibrated ceiling. A woman running toward a burning outbuilding. A group of teenagers who had, moments before the pulse, been in the middle of an argument that had nothing to do with anything, their neurochemistry already elevated by ordinary adolescent fury. An elderly man sitting alone on a porch, whose readings spiked for no visible external reason at all, as if his mind simply ran hotter than the model allowed for even at rest. Ven began building a side file. It wasn't part of his job. Logistics officers tracked yield against quota. They didn't run behavioral analysis. That was a different department with a different budget, and a director who did not appreciate junior officers wandering into her territory uninvited. But something about the pattern bothered him in a way that spreadsheets usually didn't. The flares weren't clustering around danger or violence, or anything the directorate's threat models were built to catch. They were clustering around care. The harbor cluster, when he finally pulled the raw telemetry instead of the summary, had been a rescue in progress. A ferry accident, minor by human standards, no one badly hurt, but 600 people on the dock had spent 4 minutes in a shared, uncoordinated, entirely voluntary effort to pull strangers out of cold water. Their neurochemistry had spiked not from fear for themselves, but from something the directorate's classification system didn't have a clean word for. The closest existing tag in the behavioral taxonomy was altruistic urgency, transient, a category so rare across 41 prior harvested species that it had never needed a subcategory before. Humans, it turned out, had an enormous subcategory. The directorate's onboard psych division, 3 researchers who had spent most of the mission so far playing a card game Ven didn't recognize, got pulled into emergency rotation by the second week. Their reports started arriving faster than Ven could read them, each one a little more uneasy than the last. Humans, the reports found, did not process threat and lost the way the directorate's models predicted. A species with genuinely coordinated defense capability, the kind the approval memo had ruled out, would have organized, armed itself, formed alliances, targeted infrastructure. Humans mostly didn't do that, not at first, not in any way the directorate's threat sensors were built to flag as dangerous. What they did instead was worse, in a sense the directorate had no framework for. They kept showing up for each other, one at a time, in numbers too small to register as an organized force and too constant to ever fully die down. A rescue worker who had lost his entire crew to a stasis pulse 2 days earlier walked back into the collapsed section of a stasis-affected building anyway, alone on the theory, technically wrong as it turned out, since the harvested subjects weren't trapped in any physical sense the rescue worker could reach, that someone might still be alive under the rubble. His neurochemistry, recorded by a drone that happened to be tracking the area, was the highest spike the psych division had logged all week. He wasn't afraid. He wasn't hopeful exactly. He was doing something the directorate's taxonomy eventually just labeled, with visible discomfort in the report's phrasing, refusal to stop. It happened again with a mother 3 towns over, searching for a teenage son who had, in fact, already been harvested, cleanly and painlessly 6 hours earlier. She did not know that. She searched anyway for 9 straight hours, well past the point any rational actor would have concluded the search was hopeless. When directorate observers finally confirmed the boy's harvest status to their own internal logs, closing out that particular case as resolved, the mother was still searching. She searched for 3 more days. The Psych Division's report used the phrase human grief functions do not deactivate on a rational timetable, and flagged it, almost apologetically, as a finding with fleet-wide implications. Ven read that line at his workstation at what the ship's clock called 0300, alone on the logistics deck, and felt something shift in his chest that he did not have a directorate word for either. The hospital incident, when it reached his desk 2 days later, was the one that finally made him stop treating his side file as a private curiosity and start treating it as something closer to evidence. A mid-sized medical facility in a temperate coastal region had been scheduled for a routine harvest sweep, routine at least, in the sense that no prior flare activity had been logged in the district. The extraction team's projections were straightforward. A contained building, several hundred occupants, most of them already sedated or immobile for unrelated medical reasons, which the directorate's models treated as an efficiency bonus. Stationary, low-stress targets were normally the easiest harvests of all. The stasis pulse went out at a scheduled interval during what the humans called the night shift. Patients entrained without incident, exactly as predicted. The staff did not. It wasn't panic. The Psych Division's report was careful about that distinction, because panic was a behavior the directorate's models understood and could plan around. What the surveillance drones recorded instead was a small number of medical staff, 11, according to the final count, moving calmly and with what the report's language struggled to characterize as anything other than purpose, from bed to bed, checking each unresponsive patient by hand rather than trusting their own instruments, as though refusing to believe a machine's readout over the evidence of their own fingers on a wrist. Their neurochemistry, monitored remotely out of pure directorate curiosity by that point, spiked not at the moment of discovery but afterward, gradually, as the shape of what had happened became clear to them one patient at a time. None of them ran. None of them tried to raise an alarm that could have reached anyone in time to matter. A junior nurse, the report noted, sat down on the floor of a corridor between two harvested patients and stayed there for 4 hours, past the end of her shift, until a colleague found her and had to physically help her stand. She had not been trying to save anyone. There was, by the time she sat down, no one left in that ward to save. She had simply been unwilling to leave the room empty of anyone who remembered the people who had just been in it. The Psych Division flagged this behavior under a tag they'd had to invent that week: witnessing. It had no clear tactical value. It slowed no extraction, endangered no directorate personnel, accomplished nothing that any prior species threat model would have called resistance. And yet Venn found, reading the transcript at his workstation, that it unsettled him more than the barricades or the singing ever had. Humans, it seemed, would spend hours of their own finite lives doing something with no measurable purpose at all, simply because leaving felt, to them, like a second harm layered on top of the first. He added the hospital incident to his chart under a new column he labeled privately, in a naming convention that would have meant nothing to anyone else who might have opened the file: cost without object. The directorate had built an entire species classification system, refined across 11,000 cycles, around the assumption that any sustained behavior served some calculable end. Humans, it was becoming clear, sometimes acted purely because stopping was worse. By the third week, the harvest quota was at 44% of projection, and Director Vry had stopped telling the logistics team not to overreact. The problem, as the fleet strategists eventually mapped it, wasn't any single flare event. It was the compounding cost. Every failed stasis attempt didn't just cost the yield of that specific cluster. It burned processing cycles recalibrating the field, delayed the harvest schedule for adjacent regions, and, worst of all, gave humans in nearby areas time to notice. And humans who noticed did not, as 41 prior species had, flee or hide in patterns the directorate's containment models were built to predict. They organized, in the loose, contradictory, maddeningly effective way humans seem to organize everything. From farm equipment into barricades no one had designed to stop an orbital harvest and somehow did anyway, slowing extraction teams by hours through sheer improvised obstruction. Venn watched footage of one such barricade during a fleet-wide strategy briefing. He technically hadn't been invited to but had quietly joined from the back row. A grain silo, rigged with what looked like nothing more sophisticated than chains and a tractor engine, had been repositioned to block a narrow access road the extraction teams needed for a rural sweep. It had cost the operation 6 hours and, more importantly, 6 hours of warning time for every town within 40 kilometers. They built that in 90 minutes, said the strategist presenting the footage, a lean, precise officer named Teledron who Venn had spoken to exactly twice, with no communication with any central authority. Independently, 3 other regions built comparable obstructions with no coordination between them, using different available materials, arriving at similar effective designs. Convergent improvisation, someone in the front row muttered. It's not the ingenuity that concerns me, Adron said. 41 prior species have shown ingenuity under threat. It's that they're doing it while singing. The room went quiet in a way that Ven, watching from the back, understood immediately, because he had seen the same footage in his own side file 2 nights earlier. A group of humans building the barricade, sweating, clearly afraid, their vitals confirmed that much, and singing anyway, something loud and off-key that the translation algorithm couldn't fully parse but flagged, with a confidence rating the algorithm rarely used as morale signaling behavior group cohesion function. They were terrified and they were laughing between verses. The directorate's models did not have a slot for that. Fear and levity were supposed to be sequential states, not simultaneous ones. Every prior harvested species the directorate had ever studied treated humor as a post-crisis processing behavior, something that happened after the threat had passed, if it happened at all. Humans seemed to treat it as fuel. Fleet Commander HFY Story, who presided over the briefing from a raised seat at the front of the room and rarely spoke during them, asked a single question when Adran finished the barricade footage. How many species, across the full harvest record, have we ever needed to devote a fleet command briefing to a supply chain problem? No one answered immediately, because the question wasn't really a request for a number. Dorian had commanded 3 prior harvests personally and had access to records going back further than that. She knew the answer before she asked it. What she wanted, Ven understood even from the back row, was for the room to say it out loud, so that no one could later claim the warning signs hadn't been named plainly. None, Adran finally said. Every prior operation resolved as a containment problem, or occasionally a resistance suppression problem. This is neither. We are not being fought. We are being made unaffordable. Dorian was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice had none of the clipped procedural tone command briefings usually carried. Then the question in front of this fleet is not how to win. It's whether winning, defined as completing the harvest as ordered, is a thing that can still happen at a cost this directorate is willing to pay. I want that framed correctly in every report going upward from this room. Not failure. Arithmetic. Ven's side file grew into something he could no longer justify calling a hobby. He started cross-referencing extraction failures against the Psych Division's behavioral tags, building his own small model in the evenings after his shift ended, because the fleet's official models kept missing what he thought was the actual pattern. It wasn't that humans were strong or fast or technologically advanced enough to threaten the fleet directly. By every metric that mattered to a warship, they were exactly as fragile as the approval memo had predicted. It was that harvesting a human seemed to generate more resistance than the harvest itself removed. He built a chart, a simple one, the kind of thing that would have gotten him laughed out of the strategy division if he'd shown it to anyone with more rank than him, plotting extraction events against subsequent flare density in surrounding regions over the following 72 hours. The correlation wasn't subtle. Every successful harvest in a populated area produced a measurable spike in flare resistance nearby within a day, as word spread, as people who hadn't been directly affected nonetheless generated the same acute stress neurochemistry that made them impossible to entrain. Grief, once released into a population, didn't stay contained to the people who'd lost someone. It moved. It recruited. Humans who had never met the harvested dead attended vigils for them anyway, stood in crowds under open sky in numbers that made stasis field calibration a nightmare, held candles and sang the same off-key, group cohesion songs that Adran's briefing had flagged as concerning. The efficiency curve wasn't declining. It was inverting. The directorate was, mathematically, making more resistance than it was removing biomass. Ven wasn't the only one who noticed the pattern shift, though he was among the few tracking it from a spreadsheet rather than a ground position. Extraction technician Rel Sova, a broad-shouldered field operative with 9 harvests behind him and a reputation for treating every assignment with the same board efficiency, was part of a ground team assigned to a residential extraction zone in the 4th week, and his after-action report, which Ven pulled purely out of habit, read nothing like his previous 8. Sova's team had been sent to complete a partial harvest, a cluster of 40-some residents whose stasis field had failed to fully close during the automated sweep. Ground extraction was rare, expensive, slow, normally reserved for high-value targets or equipment recovery, but the directorate wanted the region's numbers closed out before command noticed the growing gap between projection and reality. It should have been simple. The residents in question were already partially entrained, disoriented, easy to process manually. What Sova's report described instead was a woman, fully conscious, who had not been harvested in the initial sweep because she had spent the stasis pulse's critical window physically restraining her own panic long enough to drag an unconscious neighbor's child out of a stalled elevator, a task that had kept her moving, adrenal, and unreachable by the field for the several seconds that mattered. By the time Sova's team arrived, she was sitting on the floor of a hallway with the child wrapped in her own coat, her own biological readings a wreck by any directorate medical standard, refusing to move, refusing to let go, watching the extraction team approach with an expression Sova's translator flagged only as unclassified, high intensity. She did not fight them. Sova's report was clear about that, almost defensive about it, as though he needed the record to reflect that nothing about the encounter had been a combat engagement in any sense the directorate would recognize. She simply would not put the child down, and every attempt to separate them for individual processing caused her readings to spike back past the calibration ceiling, undoing the field's lock and forcing the team to restart. After the fourth failed attempt, Sova made a call that was not in any procedure manual he had ever been trained on. He ordered his team to withdraw and mark the pair as an equipment loss anomaly rather than force a fifth attempt. His report ended with a line Ven read more than once. *recommend command review whether continued ground extraction in populated zones remains cost-effective. Field teams are not equipped, psychologically or procedurally, for repeated exposure to this behavior pattern. Request reassignment. Sova, 9 harvests in, had never once requested reassignment before. Ven brought the chart to Director Vrai on the 26th day, expecting to be dismissed. Instead she looked at it for a long time, her broad face unreadable in the way senior cultivators train themselves to be, and then asked him a question that wasn't in any onboarding packet he'd ever read. What do they call it? The behavior. Is there a word for it in their languages? Ven had wondered the same thing. He'd pulled transcripts, translated broadcasts, the strange scraps of human media the fleet's intelligence division had gathered before the approval memo was ever signed. There wasn't one word. There were hundreds, in hundreds of languages, clustering loosely around concepts the translation algorithms kept flagging with low-confidence tags. Devotion, stubbornness, love, spite, hope, refusal. The closest single idea, if you forced all of it into one shape, was something like, "We do not leave our own, even when leaving would cost us less." They don't have a clean word for it, Ven said. I think that might be the point. Vrai didn't answer him for a long moment. Then she said quietly, in a tone Ven had never heard from her before, "Neither do we, and we're going to need one." In the days between that conversation and the withdrawal order, Ven kept returning to a single piece of footage that had never made it into any official briefing, because it was too small, too ordinary to qualify as a strategic finding. It had been captured almost by accident, by a surveillance drone repositioning between assignments over a schoolyard in a region where no harvest had even been scheduled that week. A structural fire, unrelated to any directorate activity, had broken out in a building beside the school. It was the kind of mundane human catastrophe that happened constantly and meant nothing to the harvest operation one way or another, except that the drone, in the seconds before it moved on, recorded a teacher, an unremarkable middle-aged woman with no combat training and no equipment beyond what was already in the classroom, positioning her body between a group of children and a wall of smoke pushing through a doorway, physically smaller than several of the students she was shielding, holding her ground anyway until every one of them had gotten past her and out. She did not know a fleet of alien ships was in orbit. She did not know she was being watched by anything other than the smoke itself. She simply did the thing that Ven was beginning to suspect humans did by some reflex the directorate had never successfully modeled in any other species. Put themselves, without calculation, between danger and whoever happened to be smaller or slower or more afraid than they were. It wasn't a flare event. It generated no extraction failure, cost the fleet nothing directly. Ven kept it in his side file anyway, filed under no category at all, because he had started to understand that the barricades and the vigils and the nurse who wouldn't leave the corridor were not separate behaviors that happened to share a species. They were the same behavior, wearing different clothes, appearing anywhere a human found someone smaller, slower, or more lost than themselves. The directorate had spent 11,000 cycles building a model of what made a species dangerous. It had never occurred to anyone to build a model for a species that was, in its own uncoordinated and unbudgeted way, almost entirely organized around not leaving anyone behind. The order to withdraw came on the 31st day, though it wasn't called a withdrawal in the official communication that went out fleet-wide. It was called a strategic reassessment of extraction viability, which meant the same thing dressed in language that would look better in the Directorate's permanent records. By then, the numbers had stopped being subtle. Total harvest yield across all attempted regions sat at 19% of original projection. Equipment losses, stasis field generators burned out by repeated failed entrainment attempts, extraction shuttles delayed or damaged by improvised obstruction, had climbed high enough that the operation's cost-benefit ratio had gone fully negative, a state the Directorate's financial models flagged in a color reserved for catastrophic miscalculation. And the flare density chart, Ven's chart, the one he'd built alone on his own time out of stubbornness that he privately suspected was its own small, human-adjacent thing, showed no sign of plateauing. If anything, it was accelerating. 3 months into the operation, at that trajectory, harvesting Earth would have generated more organized human resistance than the entire rest of the galaxy's harvested population combined. Ven stood on the logistics deck and watched the withdrawal order propagate across the fleet's status boards, ship by ship, region by region, the extraction shuttles pulling back from human airspace in the same quiet, procedural way they'd arrived. There had been a brief, unofficial debate on the command deck before the order finalized. One Ven only heard about secondhand from Vry afterward. A minority faction among the strategists had argued for a harder approach. Abandon the painless stasis protocol entirely and shift to a faster, cruder extraction method, the kind the Directorate reserved for species deemed too costly to harvest cleanly. It would have meant giving up the one standard the Cultivate Directorate had built its entire self-image around across 11,000 cycles, that harvested species never suffered, never fought, never even knew what had happened to them until it was over. Fleet Commander Dorian had ended the debate in under a minute, according to Vry. "We do not become what we've spent 11,000 cycles avoiding becoming," she'd said, "because we could not make the arithmetic work on a species that refuses to leave its own behind. If that is genuinely the choice in front of this fleet, the choice was already made the day the standard was written. Withdraw." There was no final battle. No dramatic human fleet rising to meet them in orbit because humans had no fleet to rise with. There was just a slow, grinding retreat, forced not by force but by cost, by the simple, compounding, unbudgeted expense of a species that would not stop looking for each other. He thought about the mother who searched for 3 days past the point of rational hope. The rescue worker who went back into rubble alone. The barricade builders singing off-key while afraid. The nurse who sat on a corridor floor for 4 hours guarding a room that no longer held anyone to guard. The teacher who never learned she'd been watched. None of them had known, in any way that mattered, that they were the reason the fleet was leaving. They hadn't been trying to defeat an invasion. They had just been doing, over and over, in 1,000 uncoordinated variations, the same small, unbearable thing humans apparently could not stop themselves from doing for one another, and it had been enough. The final withdrawal telemetry, the last dataset Ven ever pulled from Sol 3 before the file was sealed, showed something the strategy division never bothered to annotate because it wasn't the kind of thing strategy divisions tracked. In the hours after the fleet's ships broke orbit and turned outward, ground-level surveillance that hadn't yet been shut down recorded human settlements doing something almost absurdly small in scale, set against everything that had just happened above them. People walked outside. They stood in streets and open fields, looking up at a sky that, as far as most of them knew, had only just stopped behaving strangely, with no clear understanding yet of what had passed over them or why it had left. Some of them were crying. A great many more of them were simply standing near each other, close enough to touch, in the particular silence of people counting, without needing to say so aloud, who was still there. Ven watched that footage longer than any operational report required. There was no triumph in it. No one on the ground had won a battle because, as far as any of them would ever know, no battle had been fought at all. There was only the ordinary, exhausted relief of a species checking on itself, the same reflex that had made the whole operation impossible to complete, now turned inward, toward each other, for no audience and no purpose except itself. Ven's demotion came 11 days after the fleet's return to Directorate space, and it did not, in the end, feel like the injustice he might once have expected it to feel like. Someone had to be responsible for the Sol 3 miscalculation on paper, and a junior logistics officer with an unauthorized side file was an easier answer than admitting the approval memo itself had been wrong from its first line. He was reassigned to the archive division, cataloging closed cases, a job with no strategic weight and no room for further ambition. Director Vrai came to see him off on his last day on the logistics deck, which surprised him more than the demotion had. She didn't apologize, and he hadn't expected her to. Apology wasn't a currency senior cultivators traded in, not upward through a chain of command that needed someone's name on the failure before it could close the file. What she did instead was set a small data chip on his desk, unlabeled, and tell him to read it once he was somewhere no one else would be looking over his shoulder. It turned out to be her own side file, kept in parallel to his without either of them knowing, built from the same instinct he'd trusted in himself and assumed no one senior to him would share. Hers went back further, though, a comparative study, drawn from the Directorate's full 11,000 cycle archive, searching for any prior harvested species that had shown even a fraction of the behavior pattern Sol 3 had produced. She'd found 6 candidates, all partial matches, all from species whose harvests had gone unusually slowly, unusually expensively, and had been quietly written up afterward as isolated anomalies rather than examined as a category. No one, in 11,000 cycles, had ever put the 6 cases in the same room together. Ven wondered, reading it, how many other quiet anomalies were sitting in other officers' private files across the fleet, each one filed away as a personal curiosity rather than raised as a warning, because raising it meant questioning a system no junior officer was rewarded for questioning. "I'm not telling you this to make you feel better about the archive division," Vrai had said before she left. "I'm telling you because someone in this directorate should know the truth doesn't always announce itself the first time it shows up. Sometimes it just sits in someone's private file, waiting for the 4th or 5th or 600th flare event before anyone's willing to say it out loud." It was there, 6 months later, that he found himself once again holding the Sol 3 dossier, now formally closed, now formally stamped. "Do not engage. Unquantifiable." He had expected, when he first saw that stamp on an unfinished file, that it would feel like an ending. Looking at it now, complete, he understood it differently. It wasn't a verdict on what humanity was. It was an admission of what the Directorate had never had a model for. A species whose members would spend themselves without limit for people they might never even meet, and who somehow, without meaning to, without organizing, without even understanding they'd done it, had made themselves too expensive to take. Then closed the file. Somewhere past a G-type star nobody in the Directorate would ever approach again, humans were almost certainly still burying their dead, still searching past the point of hope, still singing off-key while afraid, going on unaware and unbothered, exactly as they always had, having lost people they loved and having no idea at all how close they had come to losing everything. He thought, before he filed it away for good, about the line from the original approval memo, the one that had started all of it. Species presents no coordinated defense capability and is expected to offer negligible resistance. It was, strictly speaking, still true. Humans had never coordinated anything. There had been no council, no unified command, no shared plan passed between the nurse and the teacher and the mother and the barricade builders singing off-key in a field none of them would ever visit. They had never known about each other at all. That, Ven had finally come to understand, was the part the Directorate's 11,000 cycles of harvest data had never prepared anyone to model. It was not a defense. It was not a strategy. It was simply what happened, apparently without exception and without instruction, when you tried to take even one member of a species built all the way down to reach for whoever stood next to them. Multiply that reflex by 9 billion people who had never met and would never meet, scattered across a single fragile, blue, unremarkable world, and it stopped looking like negligible resistance at all. It looked, in the only language the Directorate had ever managed to attach to it, like the single most expensive thing in the galaxy. He filed the dossier under closed and no further action, and for the first time since he joined the Directorate, he found himself hoping, in some small and unquantifiable way of his own, that no one ever opened it again.